Hey, folks. Um, I apologize in advance if there's any external noises on this video. There's been, for some reason, barking dogs and trucks backing up have been quite active today around my apartment. So I'm hoping I can get this done in one video. We'll see. We kind of had the background leading up to this in speaking about genetics and inheritance. Now I kind of want to put that together or use that as background to go into evolution. So I want to give you a little bit of a timeline. We sometimes we talk about Darwin or the theory of evolution as if it just came to be all of a sudden, and everything was there and everything fit together immediately, but it actually was a much longer process than that. So some of these things we haven't talked about, but we'll talk about some of them. So Darwin's voyage on the HMS Beagle, which was a ship that he sailed on that kind of gave him the impetus for coming up with the idea of natural selection. That took place between 1831 and 1836. There was another gentleman who came up with essentially the same idea, or very similar, as Darwin. That was Alfred Russel Wallace, and he'd been working on this idea of what later became called natural selection. And he wrote to Darwin in 1858 to be like, "Hey, you're a respected thinker. What do you think of this idea?" And Darwin was like, "Oh crap! I've been working on this for like 20 years. I think it's finally time to publish." So Darwin publishes on the origin of species the next year. Now Mendel, who we talked about, the pea guy, the monk who instead of drinking beer was playing around with peas. His paper was originally published in 1866. However, Darwin knew nothing about it really, unfortunately. DNA was first isolated. They called it nuclein at the time in 1869, but they didn't know what its function was. They just were able to kind of isolate the molecule from cells. Oops. Now, Mendel's work was largely ignored until around 1900, when Darwin's work was really, gaining a lot of momentum, becoming accepted more and more. But the key that no one could really figure out was inheritance. And then people rediscovered Mendel's work around 1900, and they're like, "Oh, hey, this guy, the pea guy, we should have paid attention to him before." It wasn't until 1952 that the role of DNA in heredity was confirmed. That they finally proved the key role that DNA plays in inheritance. The structure of DNA was discovered in 1953. So that's a pretty long timeline. It took a long time for everything to fit together. So let's just go over a little bit about Charles Darwin, Chucky D as I like to call him, and natural selection, or Big D sometimes. So he was born in 1809 into a pretty wealthy family. His dad was a doctor in England, and his dad wanted him to be either a doctor as well or a clergyman. And in fact, Darwin actually did a bit of studying for both of those things, but really he was more into sort of like studying the natural world. I was trying to think of a good way to say like when I played baseball as a kid, but I was more like the outfielder that was watching the butterflies, or at least that's what that's what they used to say. So he was kind of that kind of guy, really interested in the natural world around him. And as an interesting fact to put this in context with the time period, Darwin actually learned taxidermy, so how to preserve specimens that he might find on voyages, from John Edmonstone, who was a freed former slave And actually, I think I have an article that I'll post just in case you're curious. I won't ask you about it, but I think there was an article about John Edmund Stone that came out recently. So the HMS Beagle that I mentioned before, it was a ship, Her Majesty's ship, or maybe it was His Majesty at the time. So he was offered a position as a naturalist, which means he would kind of collect data on flora and fauna in different places along the voyage of this ship. And the ship actually, so it started here in Plymouth, England, and it went down towards the eastern coast of South America. And as you can see, it made several stops around there and then around the west coast. And then it sailed around the globe, touching off there, it looks like in New Zealand, and then Australia, Tasmania, Australia, around the southern tip of Africa, back to South America, and then finally back up to England. So this was a really long voyage. And so it took, well, first of all, it was unpaid. So in order to really be a contributing scientist back in that day, you pretty much had to come from some money. This was a self-funded position. It lasted for almost 5 years. So it left on just after Christmas on 1831, and came back sometime in 1836. And it was what Darwin saw on that voyage. You've probably heard of the Galapagos finches on the Galapagos Islands. He studied sort of the variations in those finches and their relationship to the environment and the relationship of the finches on the islands to the finches on the mainland. And it was experiences like that that gave him the idea of natural selection. And but his major magnum opus on natural selection did not get published until 1859 because he was thinking, he was writing, he wanted to make this big tome, and then finally the pressure came to publish when Alfred Russel Wallace had a similar idea. So Darwin hurried and put everything together to publish it. I will post this video for you separately. It's just a short little animated thing about Darwin, putting him into context. Now, this is key. The idea of evolution, I'm just going to use my pen only because it's kind of fun. The idea of evolution was not unique to Darwin. Others had postulated similar types of things in terms of change in species and populations of animals over time. It was something that other scientists had long considered, but obviously it wasn't something that was widely necessarily accepted in mainstream. It was Darwin's not famous for evolution per se. He's famous for coming up with natural selection, which is a mechanism through which change occurs. And that's what was his unique contribution, and that's what was controversial at the time, because people saw it. Recall that this is occurring after the Enlightenment, but in the Romantic period, there were still a lot of folks who put sort of religious epistemology and scientific epistemology pretty close together, and if science conflicted with interpretation of religion at the time, it was kind of a big deal. And so the idea that change in species could occur over time without direct intervention of divine forces was kind of controversial in some circles. And the way that scripture was interpreted by some at the time, Christian scripture, was that if God created all the different animals and plants, God would have created them perfect from the beginning. There would be no real need to change, and if they did change, it would be God changing them. And this idea of natural selection seemed kind of divorced from that. Natural selection was called natural selection because there was already this idea of selection in terms of breeding, right? What we now call artificial selection, selective breeding of animals and plants for certain traits, right? All these dogs in this picture are related to a wolf eventually, right? So how do you get all these fantastic varieties of dogs? Well, you select for specific traits and you breed individuals together that have desired traits, essentially, over generations and generations and generations, right? You don't take a wolf and then in the next generation that wolf's kids are a Great Dane and a Chihuahua, right? It takes time, and it takes in the case of artificial selection, where people are trying to select particular traits that they want, it takes a directed type of selection. But natural selection is something different. Essentially, what Darwin said is that you need the following conditions to get this natural selection. And in fact, there should be nothing at all controversial about this. And I mean, it's not really controversial now, except in small circles. But this is essentially like a logical and mathematical certainty, right? Darwin used the term a struggle for survival. All that means is that there is a finite number of resources in a given ecosystem. And if you have a population of individuals who all need to exploit those resources, eventually the population will grow to a point where it's stretching how many resources are actually available for that population. So there's going to be some kind of competition, and any edge in that competition to get those resources is going to mean individuals with that edge will be more successful reproductively, either because they live longer or because it gives them some edge in reproduction. So he felt like this idea of competition was kind of a necessary one. I don't know that scientists today would say it really needs to get quite to that point, but nonetheless, a variation in traits. So if you think about the dogs coming from the wolf, you can't make a trait out of thin air. There has to be a certain variation in the population to begin with. So let's say you have a population of wolves, and some are aggressive and maybe skittish of humans, and those ones are going to be very difficult to domesticate. Just as an aside, I think the consensus today is that the wolves that were the ancestors of dogs eventually sort of domesticated themselves by just approaching humans over time, and it was like sort of a symbiotic process. But nonetheless, you have to have a variation, right? So maybe there are some wolves that are a little bit less aggressive towards humans and a little bit more intrepid about getting close to human settlements and starting to scavenge for food around human settlements. And eventually those are the ones that have the temperament to be able to be domesticated to sort of live with humans. Also, you have to have a variation in size, because if you don't have a variation in size, how are you going to get like a Great Dane eventually and a Chihuahua eventually? Now, that doesn't mean that kind of extreme has to exist at first, but there has to be some variation that you can select from. And that variation needs to be heritable, which means it can be inherited in the next generation somehow, right? So if you want to select for larger wolves and dogs to eventually make something like a Great Dane, selecting it and breeding two together that have the desired traits isn't going to do anything if they can't pass those traits on somehow to their offspring. So whatever that variation is, it has to be heritable. And then differential reproduction, which essentially just means that traits that are favorable in a particular environment will tend to allow individuals that have those traits to reproduce more. Again, like I said, either because they live longer, they reproduce longer, they're more successful at reproducing, and ones with traits that are not beneficial in particular environments will reproduce less. So there has to be some difference there. I will also post this video. This is a really kind of key idea that was a phenomenon that sort of proved Darwin's point that occurred during the Industrial Revolution in the UK. It was, I'll just give you the basics. There are these moths. They're called peppered moths, and the sort of original variety, the predominant variety, right around the start of the Industrial Revolution was this cookies and cream color that you see here in this video. And those blended in very well. They camouflaged themselves very well against, like, say, birch trees or trees with like a light kind of bark, which were, at high frequency in that environment at the time. But of course, there's some variation in the color, and there are new mutations that occur all the time, right? So any kind of dark variation would have stood out on the light tree bark, right? And they could have been picked off very easily, could have been spotted very easily and picked off by any kind of predators like birds. However, as the environment changed with the Industrial Revolution, you had tons and tons of soot and particulate matter being spewed into the air, pollution, and those over time those tree trunks started to darken because of all that particulate matter, and a dark mutation, a dark variety of this, all of a sudden became more adaptive than the light variety. So it was actually documented that over the years, the dark variety started to become more predominant in the population than the light variety. And that's because, again, there was differential reproduction, right? There was this mutation that was heritable that caused a difference in coloration to a darker color. It happened to blend in better, so it gave it an edge in the environment. It was able to outcompete the lighter colored moths in that environment, and it was able to reproduce more because it lived longer, and it passed that on to its offspring. So there's this idea in evolutionary theory of fitness, and I should mention to you this is really important. When we talk about a theory in science, a theory is not just a guess in science, okay? Let me just make that clear, not a guess. A hypothesis is closer to an educated guess. A hypothesis is you notice you notice a pattern, you make some observations, you come up with what you think the relation is between cause and effect, and then you put it in a testable form. A theory is essentially what happens when a hypothesis has been repeatedly tested, and it has never failed to accurately predict, the outcome of something. So it has withstood the test of time. So a theory is about as close to fact as you get in science, in the sense that it's something that everybody tends to agree on. Now, nothing is 100% in science, because an important part of the scientific method is that if there is evidence in the future that refutes or contradicts some portion of an accepted theory or a hypothesis, then you have to sort of go back and tweak that and then retest it. Okay. So evolutionary theory isn't just a guess. It has been tested repeatedly. I have no idea how I can erase this. Nope, that doesn't work. Nope, that doesn't work. Okay, well, I'm sorry to ruin our slide. Darwin never actually used the phrase survival of the fittest. Okay, that was not Darwin. That was actually Herbert Spencer, who was this philosopher slash political theorist slash maybe pseudo-economist. And he was associated with social Darwinism. So Herbert Spencer was a big booster for early industrial capitalism. And he thought, oh my God, capitalism is the purest form of evolution in society because those who have the initiative and the drive and the imagination will rise to the top, and those who are lazy and uneducated will sink to the bottom. And so he came up with this idea of social Darwinism. It was not something that Darwin himself advocated. And again, I want to stress, Darwin never used the phrase survival of the fittest. It was just a way that Herbert Spencer sort of summarized his take on natural selection and then applied that to his ideas about the social world. So in evolution, fitness, it means reproductive success relative to others in the population, okay? It does not necessarily mean anything in particular like strength or endurance or intelligence. It depends on the environment, okay? So it's not, it's not like this kind of thing where it's always just like the most brute strength is the most fit. That's, not the case. If that were the case all the time, then Neanderthals would have populated the globe, and our species, Homo sapiens, wouldn't be here because Neanderthals were larger than us in terms of body mass. So it's not just about that. It's about reproductive success relative to others. So it's a relative thing, okay? There is no absolute fitness. You know what I'm saying? It's relative to something else. So if individuals with a certain trait on average have 3 children over their lifespan, and individuals with another trait have an average of 4 individuals in their lifespan, then those latter individuals have a relative fitness advantage over the others. Okay, it's about reproductive success. All right, so let's get down to today's modern accepted definition of evolution. It's actually quite simple. Evolution is, and this is key, please pay attention to that. Evolution is defined as a change in allele frequency in a population over time, okay? So the key words here are change, frequency, population, and time, okay? So there are going to be, like in any population where there are polymorphisms, meaning there are different versions of genes, okay? There are different alleles, right? There's going to be a certain frequency, frequency of lactase persistent versus lactase impersistent. So lactose tolerance, lactose intolerance. Certain frequencies of whatever, different types of hair color or any trait that you can think of. Those are not maybe the best examples, but any trait that you can think of that has different varieties, no population is going to be 100% the same in all traits, right? There's going to be a difference, and you can calculate the frequency of the different traits in a population. Now, so evolution is a change in that frequency, meaning that the original state of mankind, humankind, womankind, whatever you want to say, people, Homo sapiens, is to be lactose intolerant. And I'll go into that some other time. Again, I could ramble on about that for a while, because we're the only mammal that occasionally will get capture individual other mammals who are milk producing, and drink their milk, right? What other animal has a herd of some other species and drinks its milk? None, right? All mammals drink milk when they're babies, but eventually you stop breastfeeding, hopefully, right? So your body is sort of programmed naturally to turn off the faucet of the enzyme that is necessary to break down lactose. But in some populations, because of a history of dairying and pastoralism and a need to rely on that because of the environment, this mutation that sort of broke that faucet, so it's constantly running and you're constantly producing the enzyme lactase, which is necessary to break down lactose. The individuals with that mutation ended up doing better in these marginal environments where milk from other animals ended up being an important source of calories and nutrients. So that the frequency of that trait went from maybe a small number of individuals that had that mutation, and over time the individuals with that mutation were able to reproduce more than the other individuals, and the frequency shifted, right? And so over time is key because, like I said, you don't go from a wolf to both a Great Dane and a Chihuahua in one generation. This happens over generations and generations and generations. Okay? So individuals do not evolve. Populations do. Okay? And it doesn't happen in an individual lifetime. It happens over generations. Oh my Lord. It's so hard to write on that thing. So how it deals with how common or rare traits are. I already said that. Change in frequency can only happen on a population level. It doesn't occur in individuals. Happens over generations. So here's a little schematic. Let's say here's generation one. All the shapes in that circle represent a population. You've got 3 circle shapes. You've got 2 hexagon shapes. You've got 1 triangle shape, 1 diamond shape. So you have a variation in shape. You also have a variation in color. Okay, so over time, here's generation 2, let's say, the offspring of generation 1. All of a sudden, you've only got 1 circle. So the frequency of circles went from 3 out of 7 to 1 out of 4, 5, 6, 7, okay? So the frequency of circles decreased, the frequency of triangles increased, the frequency of the orange color increased, the frequency of the blue color decreased. Okay, so there are changes in these frequencies over time, over generations. Okay. Now there's different types of selection. So just to illustrate this, let's say there's a population of some kind of field mouse. And there's a variation in the color of the fur of those field mice, right? There are some lighter ones that are at a relatively small proportion of the population, some dark ones that are also a small portion of the population. The average is kind of somewhere in the middle with this lighter color. But let's say something happens in the environment, like there's a volcanic eruption, and the ash and the lava make the soil and the earth that the mice live on and in darker. So there's something called directional selection here, where the sort of distribution of colors in this population will shift in a particular direction, right? So it went from the original population having an average here on kind of the middle light side to a darker average, right? So that's directional selection. There's also something called diversifying selection, where here's the original population, the distribution of the original population. Well, maybe there's this volcanic eruption, but it only impacts like an area kind of close to the volcano, and the field mice that live further out are still in their in an environment that's kind of light. Maybe it gets lighter for some reason. Maybe it gets drier. Who knows what? So if the habitat sort of diversifies, then the dark colored mice are the most fit in one particular part of the environment, and the light colored mice are the most fit in another part of the environment, so those end up being the most frequent varieties. The ones in the middle don't do particularly well in either type of environment, so the frequency of that color decreases. So that's called diversifying selection. And then there's stabilizing selection. And, there's different versions of this in all kinds of phenomena, but let's just say like human height. Obviously, like, there's sort of a constraint. There's a stabilizing selection that keeps human height within a certain range. It's a fairly large range, but you don't see too many full-grown adult individuals who are 2-3 feet tall, right? And you don't see many that are like 7-8 feet tall. So there's this stabilizing selection that where the extremes are sort of at a relative disadvantage, so they're selected against, and kind of this area in the middle is selected for. Okay, so directional selection, diversifying selection, and stabilizing selection. I know I was hoping to do this in one video, but this 4 forces of evolution, it's going to require some explanation. So I'm gonna break this into 2. I'll see you back here for 4 forces of evolution. Catch you soon.